August 1944. The morning sun rises over endless rows of Iowa corn, the air thick with the smell of soil and dew. A military truck rattles down a gravel road, its canvas cover flapping as it carries 24 German prisoners of war. Their uniforms are faded, patched, and dusted with Atlantic salt. They expect hostility, taunts, hunger, suspicion. Instead, as the truck pulls into a family farm bordered by red barns and oak trees, they see a table laid out near the fields. Tin pitchers of milk, bread loaves still steaming, butter, bacon, and eggs cooling on enamel plates. An American farmer in denim overalls waves for them to step down. No rifles are raised. The guards stand at ease. The prisoners hesitate, watching smoke curl from the kitchen chimney. One man, a former infantry corporal from Bavaria, stares at a piece of buttered bread like it's a trick. He hasn't seen real butter since 1942. When he finally takes a bite, his hands tremble. Across the table, the farmer nods once, wordless. For the German, it feels impossible, that in the land of his enemy he might eat better than he ever had under his own flag. By mid-1944, the United States had become the improbable warden of an entire defeated army. From North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, German prisoners poured into Allied custody faster than Europe could contain them. Britain's camps overflowed, shipping space was limited, and so Washington agreed to take the surplus across the Atlantic. Within months, Liberty ships that had once carried tanks to war now carried men in gray, tens of thousands at a time, bound for ports in Virginia, New York, and Louisiana. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, these prisoners were promised food, shelter, medical care, and the right to work for pay. For many Americans, it was an uneasy generosity. Their sons were still dying in France, yet trainloads of captured enemies rolled peacefully through the heartland. Barbed wire compounds appeared almost overnight across 46 states. By the war's end, more than 400,000 German POWs would live on American soil, guarded not by battle-hardened soldiers, but often by middle-aged reservists and rural police. The government's plan was pragmatic. The wartime labor shortage had emptied farms and factories as millions of Americans served overseas. POWs could legally fill the gap, easing the pressure on domestic production. The arrangement suited everyone. The prisoners earned small wages, redeemable at camp canteens. Farmers received much-needed help, and the War Department demonstrated compliance with international law. The first shock for the prisoners came not from confinement, but from abundance. At Camp Swift in Texas, men who had survived on turnips and ersatz bread in Europe were suddenly fed balanced meals, fresh vegetables, meat, milk, even dessert. Regulations required that prisoners receive the same caloric intake as U.S. troops, about 3,200 calories per day. For men raised under wartime rationing, it felt extravagant, almost immoral. Letters and diaries, carefully censored but preserved, capture their disbelief. "The enemy feeds us as if we were his own," wrote one sergeant captured in Tunisia. "If I told my mother this, she would call me a liar." Another wrote simply, "They waste what we would fight over." The journey inland deepened that astonishment. Camps in Kansas, Georgia, and Iowa resembled small towns, complete with theaters, classrooms, and soccer fields. The War Department encouraged recreation and education, believing that occupied minds meant quiet camps. Prisoners organized orchestras, built model airplanes, and studied English. Guards often remarked that the Germans ran their compounds with more discipline than their captors demanded. For men raised under Nazi propaganda, this civility was disorienting. They had been taught that American society was decadent, chaotic, ruled by money and crime. Yet outside the wire, they saw farms humming with order, people polite but confident, shops filled with goods despite the war. It contradicted everything they had believed about democracy. And so, when farm labor details began, trucks rolling out each dawn with POW crews, it wasn't fear that struck them first. It was curiosity. The heartland of their enemy looked nothing like the wasteland their officers had promised. Farmers greeted them with cautious nods. Children watched from porches. Sometimes wives carried out baskets of fruit or cold water. Under supervision, they worked in fields of corn, cotton, and wheat that stretched farther than anything they had seen in Europe. Many prisoners would later describe that first week on American soil as a revelation, the moment when ideology began to crumble before reality. They had lost the war militarily, but it was in these quiet encounters with ordinary Americans that they began to sense the moral scale of their defeat. For the U.S., it was less about magnanimity and more about consistency. The War Department's manuals reminded every guard and commander that humane treatment was not kindness, it was policy. "The world will judge our civilization," one directive read, "by how we treat those who fought against it." Those words found their proof far from any battlefield, on the plains and farms where enemy soldiers bent their backs beside American workers, and slowly realized they were being fed better than they ever had by their own generals. Across the United States, the POW camp network became a hidden geography of the war, an archipelago of fences, guard towers, and barracks spread from the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Maine. The heart of this system lay in the rural Midwest and South, where the need for farm labor was greatest. Small satellite camps, often housing only a few hundred prisoners, were attached to larger parent compounds like Camp Algona in Iowa, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. These camps operated with an efficiency that astonished even visiting Red Cross inspectors. Each prisoner received a bed with clean sheets, 3 daily meals, and access to medical care. The contrast with conditions on the Eastern Front or in German-run labor camps was staggering. For Americans, adherence to the Geneva Convention was not simply about image, it reflected a deep-seated national confidence. A country so secure in its prosperity could afford to show mercy. The economic logic was simple. By 1944, America faced severe manpower shortages. Young men had gone overseas, and harvest seasons loomed with fewer hands. German prisoners filled that gap. Under military supervision, they worked in fields, canneries, and lumber yards for 50 to 80 cents a day, paid in camp scrip rather than cash. The money could be exchanged for cigarettes, soap, or stationery at the canteen. It was a small sum, yet the chance to work outdoors, away from wire and monotony, was priceless. For many farmers, the arrival of these men in gray uniforms was unsettling at first. They had lost sons to the same army these strangers had served. Yet practicality overcame resentment. Farmers quickly discovered that most of the Germans were polite, hard-working, and eager to please. Many had grown up in rural villages themselves and handled tools with familiarity. Over time, tension gave way to cautious trust. Guards, often older reservists or veterans of World War I, maintained discipline but rarely needed force. The rhythm of farm life imposed its own peace. Work began before sunrise, pauses at midday, and ended when the light faded. After hours, the prisoners ate in designated areas, usually barns converted into mess halls, before being trucked back to camp. The food was simple but plentiful: meatloaf, potatoes, fresh bread, coffee, sometimes even pie. Farmers often provided extra produce or leftovers, gestures that puzzled the prisoners more than any propaganda could. By late 1944, reports circulated of German POWs writing home in disbelief. "We eat like officers here," one wrote to his wife, "while you scrape potatoes from the frost." Another commented, "I am treated better by American farmers than by my own command." Censors allowed such letters through because they served a quiet strategic purpose. They showed the world how the United States treated its enemies. The abundance was not accidental. Wartime America, though rationed, was still the most productive agricultural power on Earth. Even as soldiers fought in Europe, Midwest fields produced record harvests. For German POWs, the sight of overflowing grain silos and well-fed cattle contradicted every image they had of a capitalist nation on the brink of collapse. They realized that the Reich's narrative of decadent democracy had been hollow. In Camp Algona, Iowa, a chaplain noted the transformation firsthand. At first, he wrote, they were sullen, distant. After a few weeks of work on nearby farms, they began to whistle American songs. The change was not just morale, it was worldview. Prisoners began to distinguish between the enemy government they had fought and the ordinary people now employing them. Meanwhile, the American public gradually accepted their presence. Local newspapers carried brief notices about harvest quotas met with POW help. Communities near the camps learned that these enemy aliens were less threatening than imagined. Some farmers even developed friendships, bringing coffee thermoses to the fields or exchanging family photographs. Regulations prohibited fraternization, but kindness has a way of slipping past policy. The quiet revolution of perception happened meal by meal, acre by acre. As winter approached and rations tightened in Europe, the German soldiers in America gained weight. They wrote of this with guilt and wonder. Feeding the enemy had become an act of both practicality and moral triumph, a demonstration that strength and humanity could coexist. And in those sprawling farmlands where war's noise seemed a distant echo, the seeds of post-war reconciliation were already being planted, one harvest at a time. From enemies to workers. For most German prisoners, life in the American Midwest felt like waking inside a contradiction. They had crossed the Atlantic expecting punishment and starvation. Instead, they found work, meals, and an unexpected quiet dignity. The first weeks on the farms were disorienting. The Americans who supervised them spoke little German, yet their tone carried neither hatred nor triumph. Orders were practical, not cruel. On the farms, the prisoners discovered a different kind of battle, one against sun, soil, and weather. They rose before dawn, joining the farmers in long rows of corn or beans, sweating under the same sky. The guards stayed distant, rifles slung loosely, more symbolic than threatening. The rhythm of labor, the scrape of shovels, the rustle of crops, became its own truce. What startled many prisoners most was trust. Farmers left them unsupervised for hours, confident they wouldn't flee. And they didn't. Thousands of miles from home, surrounded by open fields, where could they go? Escape felt meaningless when food was warm, water cold, and the work humane. The Americans, in turn, judged them by effort, not uniform. By the end of the season, some farmers greeted their POW crews like old hands returning for another shift. That trust cut deep. It showed the prisoners a moral order different from the one they had served under. In the Reich, worth was measured by obedience. Here, it was measured by reliability. They treated us as men, one POW recalled decades later, not as beasts of war. Feeding the front and the home front. Behind this human story ran an economic machine. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, desperate to sustain wartime output, worked with the War Department to integrate POW labor into civilian production. At peak demand in 1945, prisoners contributed over 90 million man-hours of labor across 35 states. They picked cotton in Texas, cut timber in Oregon, canned tomatoes in Maryland, and harvested corn across the Midwest. For American farmers, the arrangement was salvation. Labor costs had soared, and equipment shortages slowed planting. The arrival of disciplined, industrious German crews restored productivity. Each morning, trucks rolled out from camp gates, carrying men who only months earlier had served Rommel or fought in Normandy. Now their tools were shovels and pitchforks. The prisoners noticed something else. abundance without exploitation. Unlike in the Reich, where civilians went hungry as the military consumed everything, American prosperity seemed to lift all. Farms overflowed with produce. Even the guards ate the same food as the POWs. One report noted that captured officers, accustomed to privilege, struggled more with this equality than with captivity itself. They cannot understand a system, the camp commander wrote, in which farmers, laborers, and soldiers share the same bread. That bread became a symbol. To the Germans, the taste of white flour, butter, and coffee felt almost subversive, proof that democracy could nourish as well as command. The irony was profound. The same economy that armed their enemy was also feeding them into health. The ration paradox. The War Department's supply policy was simple but revolutionary. Prisoners received the same rations as U.S. troops. It was a decision rooted in both law and pride. America, rich in food and infrastructure, could afford decency. This parity produced scenes that astonished visiting journalists and Red Cross inspectors. While civilians in Europe queued for crumbs, German POWs in Nebraska sat down to meat, vegetables, and milk 3 times a day. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, menus included chicken stew, fruit, and baked goods. At Camp Algona, Iowa, the kitchen served coffee and butter every morning. Prisoners were issued soap, razors, and medical care at levels matching those of U.S. enlisted men. When questioned about the fairness of this system, one quartermaster replied, "Because we can." The statement carried quiet confidence. America was proving its moral superiority through abundance. The psychological effect on prisoners was immense. Hunger had defined much of their wartime identity. Many came from a Germany where food was rationed by ideology, where soldiers ate before civilians, and civilians before foreign laborers. In the U.S., that hierarchy dissolved. They realized that in this enemy nation, even the lowest prisoner ate better than his family back home. It was a revelation both humbling and painful. Some guards reported that POWs hesitated to write home about the meals, fearing their letters would sound like mockery. "We cannot describe the food," one wrote, "for shame of how well we live." The paradox was complete. America's most powerful propaganda wasn't in leaflets or radio. It was served on a plate. By the time autumn arrived, what had begun as a temporary wartime necessity had become an experiment in coexistence. The POW's disbelief was slowly replaced by understanding, and for many, admiration. Beneath the routines of field work and rations, a quiet moral argument was being made: one meal, one harvest, one handshake at a time. Farmers and their unexpected guests. For the farmers who first saw military trucks unloading German POWs at the edge of their property, the feeling was uneasy. The war was still raging. News from Europe carried headlines of death and destruction. Some had sons fighting in the Ardennes or on the Rhine. To employ the enemy felt unnatural, almost disloyal. Yet necessity eroded suspicion. Fields had to be plowed, fruit had to be picked, and there simply weren't enough local workers left to do it. At first, farmers spoke little, keeping their distance, but human curiosity bridged the silence. The POW's manners, often formal and polite, contrasted with expectations. They worked hard, rarely complained, and saluted even the foreman out of habit. Gradually, barriers dissolved. Farmers discovered that many of the prisoners were not ideologues, but ordinary men, mechanics, bakers, teachers, apprentices, drafted into a war they barely understood. By summer's end, patterns of trust emerged. Farmers began leaving the prisoners unguarded for short tasks, confident they wouldn't run. Some shared lunch under the shade of a barn. The guards, often older men from the National Guard or veterans of the First World War, supervised with leniency. One Iowa farmer remembered decades later, "They were boys. I lost one of my own in France. Feeding them felt like a small rebellion against hate. That attitude spread. The American heartland, isolated from the bombing and deprivation of Europe, became a stage for quiet reconciliation. While soldiers fought across oceans, farmers practiced peace in their own fields. The war, to them, was no longer an abstract crusade, but a series of human faces bent over the same rows of corn. When propaganda met reality. For German prisoners, the greatest dissonance wasn't physical comfort, it was moral contrast. Nazi indoctrination had painted the United States as a chaotic, soulless society driven by greed and racial mixing. Yet on these farms, they saw order, discipline, and decency without coercion. They saw women driving tractors, children in school uniforms, farmers who spoke respectfully to local officials. The degenerate democracy of their training manuals bore no resemblance to this quiet prosperity. Conversations during rest breaks, often through limited English and improvised translation, deepened that shock. American guards or farmers sometimes asked about Germany, what it looked like, how life had been before Hitler. The prisoners answered cautiously at first, then with growing honesty. They began to question aloud what they had believed. The discovery that their captors lived without fear of the state or shortages and yet showed compassion destabilized everything Nazi propaganda had built. Many later wrote that this realization was more transformative than any leaflet or speech. "Here, even the dogs are fed," one POW wrote home. "In Germany, we call this weakness. Now, I call it strength." The ideological collapse that began in those fields planted early seeds for post-war democratization. These men would return home not as conquered slaves, but as witnesses to a different kind of power, the kind built on abundance, fairness, and self-respect. Geneva and the morality of victory. Behind every act of mercy stood a principle as deliberate as any military plan. The United States understood that how it treated its prisoners would shape its legacy. Compliance with the Geneva Convention wasn't merely legal, it was moral propaganda in its purest form. In Europe, German camps starved Soviet prisoners by the millions. In the Pacific, atrocities multiplied on both sides. The U.S. sought a different narrative. Military chaplains, Red Cross inspectors, and public relations officers documented POW conditions meticulously. When international observers visited, they found evidence of humane treatment, letters home allowed, medical clinics functional, work voluntary. The system wasn't perfect, but it was consistent. America's moral advantage became tangible. Even within the camps, German officers recognized this contrast. Some requested permission to lecture their men on discipline, citing the honorable treatment they received. The U.S. command quietly allowed it, knowing respect bred order. Others, disillusioned, swore they would never again serve a regime that fed its propaganda better than its soldiers. The result was a subtle but profound shift in post-war ethics. When the war ended, the Red Cross concluded that the United States POW program had set a new international benchmark. The message was clear. Real victory isn't measured only in battles won, but in principles upheld. By 1945, the farms, camps, and kitchens of America had done something no battlefield could: change hearts. The same men who had marched under the swastika now carried memories of kindness and full stomachs. The contrast was devastating and redemptive all at once. It was not weapons that humbled them, but decency. By the summer of 1945, the German POW system in the United States had reached its quiet peak. Over 400 main and branch camps stretched from California's valleys to the plains of Kansas. War in Europe was over, but the prisoners remained, nearly 500,000 men still working, waiting, and observing their enemy's homeland from the inside. What began as shock had become daily rhythm. Yet it was during that final season, as harvests ripened and news of Germany's surrender spread through the camps, that the full weight of their experience settled in. At dawn, trucks rumbled along rural roads, their canvas covers flapping in the wind. In the back, German prisoners sat in silence, clutching lunch pails filled with bread, fruit, and sandwiches prepared by camp cooks. Some sang softly, old folk songs from Bavaria or the Rhineland. When they reached the farms, the routine began with quiet efficiency. Tools were distributed. Guards lit cigarettes and leaned against fence posts. The day unfolded beneath a vast, forgiving sky. One such scene played out near Algona, Iowa, where prisoners helped with the late wheat harvest. They were greeted by the same farmer who had hosted them the previous year. His wife set out a table under a tree, covered in checked cloth. There was stew, milk, and slices of apple pie. The men hesitated at first, still unused to generosity that expected nothing in return. The farmer motioned toward the food, saying simply, "Eat before it gets cold." It was then, amid laughter and the smell of soil, that a quiet realization spread among them. They were being fed better as captives than they had been as soldiers of the Reich. There was no pretense, no propaganda officer orchestrating this display. It was just the normal decency of a prosperous nation that saw no need to humiliate the defeated. Word of these scenes filtered through letters home, censored, but still potent. "We are treated like human beings," one soldier wrote, "and we eat meat every day. The Americans have more food than they know what to do with. I have never felt so full and so empty." Another recounted how the farmers allowed them to sit in the shade after lunch, something unthinkable under German officers. "Here," he wrote, "work is not punishment, it is life." Back in Germany, their families starved on rations of bread crusts and turnip soup. Cities lay in ruins, railways broken, factories silent. To know that the enemy's prisoners were thriving while one's own children went hungry was almost unbearable. Yet those letters, circulated quietly, became among the earliest hints that decency still existed in the world. Within the camps, a transformation occurred. Relations between guards and prisoners softened further. Discipline was maintained, but now mutual respect underpinned it. Many Americans began to see the Germans not as monsters, but as men worn out by a war none had truly controlled. In the evenings, local volunteers sometimes brought records, teaching the prisoners American songs or basic English. Baseball games replaced drills. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like cages. For the prisoners, the turning point came not in any grand gesture, but in the repetition of small mercies. The consistency of good food, honest work, and fair treatment undermined years of indoctrination. "We learned more about freedom in those fields," one former POW said decades later, "than we ever did in our classrooms." American officials noticed the same pattern. Reports to Washington described POW morale as stable, cooperative, increasingly introspective. Commanders attributed it to adequate diet, humane housing, and steady employment. Privately, they understood that America's greatest psychological weapon was not its bombs, but its breakfast tables. As summer drew to a close, Red Cross inspectors made their final rounds. They recorded weight gains, improved health, and low disciplinary incidents. One inspector, a Swiss national who had visited camps across continents, remarked that the American system feeds both body and conscience. It was a subtle acknowledgment that generosity, when consistent, becomes transformative. By harvest's end, the fields of Iowa, Kansas, and Texas stood golden and heavy. The prisoners loaded grain into silos, washed their hands, and sat to their evening meals. They knew that ships would soon carry them home, to ruins, to uncertainty, to guilt. Yet they also knew that they would carry something else back across the ocean, the memory of being fed by those they had once been told to despise. The turning point wasn't victory or surrender, it was understanding. In the act of being nourished, the men realized that their captor's strength came not from cruelty, but from fairness. That revelation, quiet and profound, would ripple far beyond the fences. The true climax of the German POW experience in America came not from any official proclamation, but from an unguarded moment when ordinary decency crossed the invisible boundary of war. By the late summer of 1945, word of Germany's surrender had settled into the camps like a quiet fog. For many prisoners, it brought not celebration, but disorientation. The Reich that had defined their identity was gone. The officers who had commanded their obedience were disgraced or dead. In that moral vacuum, America's farms became classrooms of a different kind, places where men who had served tyranny were learning the habits of freedom without ever hearing the word spoken aloud. One day at a farm outside Algona, the harvest team was finishing its shift when thunderclouds began to gather. Rain came hard and sudden, drenching the fields. The American farmer shouted for the men to take shelter in the barn. Inside, they stood dripping, unsure whether they were permitted to sit. The farmer's wife appeared, carrying mugs of coffee and a tray of cornbread. She gestured for them to eat. A corporal accepted a cup, staring at it as if unsure it was real. The guard, soaked through and shivering, laughed and said, "It's the same coffee I get." The prisoners smiled, their fear breaking into something unfamiliar, belonging. Moments like these were repeated across the country. On Thanksgiving of 1945, some camps arranged special meals for the prisoners. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, German POWs sat at long wooden tables covered in paper flags and pine branches. The menu included turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and pie. The men ate in silence at first, overwhelmed by the smell of food they hadn't seen in years. One raised his glass of milk and whispered, "So this is how you celebrate peace." For many, it was the first true meal of their lives. The psychological reversal was complete. In Germany, soldiers had been trained to see compassion as weakness. In America, they discovered it was the foundation of strength. Where the Reich ruled by fear, the Americans ruled by fairness. That contrast struck harder than any weapon. "We saw," one former POW said, "that their power came from order without terror, faith without shouting." Letters home captured this quiet revelation. "Our guards are not our enemies," a Bavarian wrote in early 1946. "They work beside us, eat with us, and laugh at the same rain." Another confessed, "We used to think we were superior. Now we see that arrogance was our starvation." Inside the camps, guards noted how attitudes had changed. Fewer escape attempts, fewer conflicts. Instead, prisoners asked for English dictionaries, church services, and agricultural manuals. Many requested to stay longer, hoping to delay their return to a shattered homeland. One camp commander remarked, "They fear going home more than they ever feared us." This transformation did not go unnoticed. U.S. officials realized that these prisoners, shaped by exposure to democracy and decency, might become seeds of change in post-war Germany. Education programs expanded, including lectures on civics, free press, and labor rights. The Red Cross recorded remarkably low rates of disciplinary problems, crediting the psychological nourishment provided by humane treatment. But the heart of it remained simpler than policy. It was the taste of bread, butter, and coffee served without malice. It was the sight of a farmer trusting a man who wore the uniform of his son's killer. It was the quiet discovery that dignity could survive defeat. As winter approached, the prisoners began their repatriation process. They boarded trains bound for ports, New York, Norfolk, New Orleans, where Liberty ships waited to carry them home. On those journeys, they passed once more through the landscapes that had redefined them, the fields, barns, and open skies of the Midwest. Some wept openly, not for lost battles, but for the realization that their enemy had given them a glimpse of the world they wanted to build. When the ships finally left harbor, the men stood at the rails watching the American coastline fade into mist. They left behind the camps, but not the lessons. Decades later, many would write of that time not as imprisonment, but as awakening. The turning point of their captivity had not been surrender. It was understanding that freedom's greatest weapon was compassion served on a full plate. When the war ended in Europe, the U.S. Army faced the vast logistical challenge of sending hundreds of thousands of prisoners home. But before repatriation began, the War Department conducted detailed interviews and health examinations. What they found astonished them. The average German POW in America weighed more and was healthier at release than at capture. Their morale was high, discipline stable, and political indoctrination visibly weakened. In short, they were leaving better fed, better educated, and less fanatical than when they arrived. For the men themselves, departure brought conflicting emotions. Home meant family, but also ruin. Germany in 1946 was a nation of rubble and hunger. News filtered through the camps, cities flattened, millions displaced, food rations measured in ounces. Many prisoners dreaded what awaited them. Letters from home spoke of black markets and starvation, of children digging through ruins for coal. Against that backdrop, the memories of American farms, of bread, milk, and laughter, seemed almost cruelly bright. At Camp Algona, farewell ceremonies were brief and quiet. Farmers who had employed the prisoners sometimes came to the camp gates to shake hands one last time. One Iowa farmer gave a departing worker his pocket knife, saying, "You worked hard. You'll need this more than I do." The young man tried to return it. The farmer refused. Such gestures, small and unsentimental, carried enormous weight. For the prisoners, they symbolized a moral generosity their own leaders had abandoned long ago. As ships filled with repatriated Germans left from ports like Newport News in New York, observers noticed an unusual calm on deck. The men stood in orderly rows, singing softly. Their faces showed relief, but also something like grief. Many had spent years under the stars and stripes, years that paradoxically had restored their faith in humanity. Upon arrival in Europe, most were processed through British and French transit camps before returning to their homes in the occupation zones. There, they were met with disbelief. Civilians, gaunt and bitter from rationing, struggled to imagine that their sons and husbands had lived well in the enemy's land. Some even accused returning POWs of exaggeration or betrayal. "You talk like an American now," one mother reportedly said to her son. He answered, "Perhaps because they treated me like a man." For others, the adjustment was painful. German prisoners who had gained weight and health now faced the thin rations of post-war Europe, barely 1,000 calories a day. They began to understand the full moral collapse of the regime they had served, a government that demanded sacrifice while its enemies extended mercy. Meanwhile, American officials recognized the long-term significance of what had occurred. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted that humane treatment of POWs had yielded psychological dividends far beyond expectation. These men would return home with first-hand knowledge of democracy's strength, not as propaganda, but as lived experience. Some were recruited into re-education programs aimed at rebuilding German civil society. Others simply carried their impressions quietly, planting them like seeds in the new soil of post-war Europe. The aftermath of captivity revealed that America's soft power, its fairness, its abundance, its restraint, had achieved what no leaflet or lecture could: respect. Among the millions who had fought under a banner of conquest, many now spoke of their captors with gratitude. Yet for both sides, the farewell was bittersweet. Farmers watched the trucks drive away, remembering the foreign workers who had become almost family. The Germans looked back through the dust of the roads, realizing they were leaving behind not just a land, but a version of themselves reborn in its fields. The repatriation of German prisoners between 1946 and 1947 marked the quiet conclusion of one of the most remarkable humanitarian episodes of the war. Over 370,000 men were shipped back across the Atlantic, each carrying a mixture of relief, nostalgia, and disbelief. They had come as enemies and were leaving as witnesses, living evidence that decency could outlast destruction. Back in Germany, their return coincided with hunger, ruin, and the slow birth of democracy under Allied occupation. The contrast was overwhelming. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne lay in rubble. Families queued for hours for bread made from barley and sawdust. The men who had eaten fresh fruit and milk in Iowa found their own children thin and hollow-eyed. Many described their time in America as a dream that could not be explained without shame. "We were prisoners, yet we lived like human beings," one wrote to a friend. "Now we are free and we starve." Those letters, factual and humble, spread through Germany's battered communities, carrying a message that shaped perceptions for decades. They told of guards who shared rations, of farmers who treated prisoners as guests, of women who smiled without fear. These stories contradicted years of Nazi propaganda and began to erode its lingering myths. They also inspired a generation that would rebuild West Germany not on conquest, but on cooperation. Historians later noted how many former POWs became early advocates for reconciliation. Some joined new political movements devoted to democracy and European unity. Others became teachers, engineers, or farmers who quietly practiced what they had learned abroad. That strength could coexist with fairness. A few even returned to America, sponsored by families who had once employed them behind fences. In small towns across the Midwest, letters arrived throughout the 1950s, written in careful English, updates on harvests, births, and the passing of seasons. Bonds forged in war's shadow endured long after the wire was gone. The American side, too, remembered. Communities that had hosted POW camps often spoke of the experience with pride. Local newspapers published retrospective pieces describing how the enemy learned our ways and how the encounter had broadened their own sense of justice. Some farmers framed the photographs they had taken with their German crews, displaying them decades later as proof that compassion had never been wasted. The government formally closed the last U.S. POW camp in 1947. The Red Cross reported that the United States had maintained near-perfect compliance with the Geneva Convention throughout the war. That record would become a moral cornerstone in the post-war order, a standard invoked during the Nuremberg trials and later conflicts. America's treatment of prisoners, once questioned at home, now stood as evidence of civilization's endurance amid global ruin. In Germany, the memory of those years lingered quietly beneath the surface of reconstruction. When the Marshall Plan began flooding Europe with aid, many former prisoners understood its logic instinctively. They had already seen American generosity up close. One veteran from Camp McCoy told an interviewer in 1952, "I believe the war had shown the worst of mankind. Then the Americans showed me the opposite. That is what I brought home." Time softened the details, but not the lesson. Decades later, reunions were held between Iowa farmers and their wartime workers. Men now gray and stooped shook hands again under open skies. They spoke of crops and families, of years lost and lives mended. No one spoke of victory or defeat, only of decency. From those humble encounters, a bridge had formed, one not built by diplomats, but by ordinary people who had chosen fairness over vengeance. In a century scarred by brutality, the quiet kindness of American farms had become one of its rare redemptions. History often remembers wars by their explosions, by the thunder of guns and the treaties that follow. Yet sometimes The truest victories happen in silence, far from the headlines, under skies filled not with smoke, but with sunlight and grain dust. The story of the German POWs who worked America's farms belongs to that quieter chapter of history, where compassion, not conquest, defined the outcome. What began as a logistical necessity evolved into a moral revelation. America, still burning with grief from battle, chose restraint over revenge. Its people, ordinary farmers, guards, and nurses, demonstrated that strength measured by decency endures longer than any victory parades. In the rhythm of plowing fields and sharing bread, two former enemies met on human ground. One offered food, the other humility. Together they proved that civilization's greatest defense is fairness practiced when no one is watching. For the German prisoners, the experience rewrote their understanding of power. They had been raised to worship discipline and fear. They left America having seen freedom organized by trust. The kindness of those who fed them, without triumph, without contempt, became a mirror reflecting all that their own regime had corrupted. It was in the warmth of a meal, in the courtesy of a stranger, that democracy revealed its quiet superiority. For the Americans, too, the lesson endured. Feeding the defeated did not weaken them. It affirmed who they were. The farmers who shared milk and pie with captured soldiers learned that compassion could coexist with patriotism, that mercy need not wait for peace. In doing so, they elevated victory into something nobler, an act of healing that outlasted hatred. Today, few of those barns or camps remain, yet the principle they embodied survives. Power tempered by mercy. Justice softened by humanity. In a century defined by destruction, the simple image endures. A German prisoner sitting beneath an American oak, breaking bread with the man who should have despised him, and finding in that shared silence that the war was already ending.